Welcome people to another edition of Ask Mark Anything. Well, a very interesting subject today, one that's dear to my heart because it was, for me, a commencement point in the prospecting game in real estate sales, and for many it's been a forgotten one. Mainly forgotten because most people would suggest or have me believe that there aren't that many private sellers, or as we commonly call them, for sale by owners in the marketplace. So what I hope to share with you over the next 15 minutes is how to engage these particular property sellers, and indeed how to get a regular flow of listings from them. So the first thing that I wanted to point out is that you have to recognize that private sellers in the very first instance are trying to sell themselves for two particular reasons. The first is a fairly obvious one, and that is to save the agent's fees. Now, whilst I don't believe this actually happens, I am more than happy to share with you how you can get around that. But nonetheless, from their perspective, they do believe that they're going to save that fee. The second reason that many property sellers actually decide to try to sell the property themselves is typically because they've had a bad experience with a real estate agent, or, for want of a better way of saying it, they just don't trust the integrity of real estate agents. And think that they can do the job a little bit better. Now, the first thing, if you want to get this right, if you want to be on top of this as you go, is to recognize that this is indeed true. Let's face it, more than half of all the properties that come to market privately do sell. Now, there's a huge question as to whether or not these properties would have sold for more money, would have been better served by estate agents. I believe all of that is true, but nonetheless, they do it, and for us, it represents a fantastic opportunity to get listings on board. I mean, you don't ring a private seller and say, I was wondering whether you're considering selling. So what I want to talk to you about is how we engage this position that we want to establish, and that's the first goal that you should have, is to position yourself as somebody who is helping them on their journey to make the move. You see, one thing doesn't change between property sellers, and that's this, that these private sellers are still fundamentally putting the property on the market because of a motive, an underlying motive. Now, even at times, it could be that very motive that's causing them to sell privately because they just believe they have to be able to save the money to make the journey work. So let's talk about how we get in. Now, I have some very simple rules. If you decide to engage this method, it will pay you handsome dividends. It may take a couple of weeks of engagement to get it running properly. It's one that I use almost certainly with my brand new recruits that come in through property careers. I certainly suggest it to anyone that's relatively new that comes to list and sell. And definitely, those of you that are aware of it, when we talk about prospecting, when you're in the foothold stage, where you're trying to get seed listings to break into a market or re-establish a market, this is, without doubt, one of the best methods you can possibly use. Because, of course, sourcing these sellers these days is relatively simple. You only need register yourself on all the private seller sites to actually be able to identify inside your local area those private sales. So what do? Jump on, you register yourself as a buyer. Now, I know that you may be not buying, and I know that some of these sites might prohibit that, but I just don't see the problem. I mean, there's public information if these properties are available, and then you get that information on board and you can identify these private sellers. Okay, so we've done that. Now, how do we engage them? Well, I say that there's some simple rules. If you go down the private seller path, you have to be the first to call. So you have to be the person, the real estate agent, that is the first to call, the one who is the last to call prior to them if they should list the property for sale, and of course the one that calls them the most often in between. Basically what I'm saying is you need to be present, and then you need to be present, I believe, in an advisory role, in one where you make a connection around relationship, and you have to have a bona fide, genuine desire to help these sellers. Now, I know this sounds a little bit evangelistic, but I almost saw myself as a real estate agent that was protecting them against the downsides of actually selling the property themselves and protecting them against any chance whatsoever of engaging with what I would call an unscrupulous agent, or one that might have let them down in the past, or one that indeed might let them down going forward. So how do we engage them? Well, it's pretty simple, really simple. You see, when I see agents, they sort of look at that telephone, having identified the seller, and they just agonise over what might be at the other end of the telephone. For me, it's a very simple call, the first one. I have absolutely no intention whatsoever of trying to get down there on the first attempt. If it happens, well and good, but it's not my sole intent. In fact, the goals that I set for myself with a property seller at the beginning, with a private seller, are to what I call the 3 W's. Now, these days, you already know the first. The first W is, where is it? Now, these days, because of open for inspections, because of the online presence, they identify, or they give you the address immediately. So that's not a problem. The second goal, so that should come straight away. I mean, you've already got that sorted straight away. The second goal is to get their name. And I don't mean their surname. We're looking to get their Christian name, which can set up the personal relationship. That's not, for assuming, of course, that they're of that age. If they're elderly people, well, we might go by the surname and address them accordingly. Now, this is more difficult than you might think. Most real estate agents come in there with a bludgeoning attitude of, I'm a real estate agent, are you going to engage agents? Here I am, give me your name, give me your number, that sort of thing. And they meet with a lot of resistance. And fundamentally, they might even meet with that ugly statement of, we've already got it sold, we're not going to give it to any other agents, we talked to you, we talked to a number of others, we've just no interest whatsoever. So that's the second goal. And the third goal, which comes a little bit later, definitely not on this call unless they invite me in, is when can I pop by? You see, the key when you're on a telephone is not to sell, it's not to tell, it's basically to set up appointments later on. It's to offer a service and give them a helping hand. So how does this call take place? Well, I simply ring, and here's the dialogue for those that you're listening, and this is especially for you, Lee Anderson, who asked this question or initiated this particular Ask Mark Anything. When the client answers the phone, I simply say, I noticed you have a property for sale on Owners Online, not in newspapers these days or wherever it might be. I noticed that there is a property for sale. Is it still available? Now, of course, what actually the seller does then is they assume that you're a buyer. So in an enthusiastic tone, they say, yes, it is. And at this point, you then just say, look, I'm an agent. Will you be considering using agents? Now, they are more, especially if it's in the beginning and you are calling them being the first to call as you should be, they'll immediately retort, we're not using agents, and just simply acknowledge that. I say, I realise that, that's why you'd be selling the property yourself. I then move to my first lure. I say, look, at the moment, we have more buyers than we have available property. And I was wondering whether or not you wouldn't mind me sending a couple of buyers your way. Now, they might think there's a catch attached, and they'll say, look, no, we're right. I say, well, really, I mean, it's no problem to me. I mean, if I can't satisfy the buyers with the owners I've got, I'm happy to send them your way. Would you mind if I sent 1 or 2 your way? Now, as they're talking, I might just out of left field. So all of these sentences, be halfway through a sentence, and then they might say to me, no, we're not. So look, can I just ask you one question, sir? What's your name? Now, there it is. Just slide that in. What's your name? Because when you ask somebody their name, almost by surprise, they cannot help but give you the answer to that question. So you get the Christian name. If you get the surname, that's fine. If you only get the Christian name, I might then say John who, and get that surname down. And I've kind of at second base insofar as I'm concerned. So that second question would be, look, I understand you're not going to sell the property, put the property in the hands of an agent just yet. I mean, after all, why would you have gone to all this trouble? But can I ask you one question? John, if you're unsuccessful in selling the property yourself, what are you going to do? Now, the answer to that one's fairly obvious, that they're going to give it to an estate agent. I say, well, good, that's what I am. All I really hope to do at this stage is have a chat to you and, if I can, give you a little bit of help, and if you are unsuccessful in selling the property yourself, well, me being the real estate agent, hopefully I'll be your primary consideration. I then start to move the conversation onto a whole host of other subjects. So without even getting down to the pop me buy. Now, this might not take place on the first call, it might take place on the second, so just be mindful of that. Don't be pushy, be helpful. So I might make mention of the advertisement, for argument's sake. I say, listen, this ad, have you had more calls from estate agents than you've had from buyers? Now, if they acknowledge this and say yes, I say, well, look, I can see why. I mean, who wrote this ad? Was it you? And if they say yes, I say, look, if you don't mind me saying so, I can tell. Would you like some help in writing an ad that'll get you more calls from buyers than it will estate agents? Now, if they say yes to this, I say, okay, when can I pop by? Again, I'm just looking to get down there to say hello. Now, of course, if they answer to that first question I mentioned before, I said, look, I've got many buyers, more buyers than I have available property. Can I send one or two your way? If they say yes, I say, well, when can I pop by? Now, hopefully there might be an open for inspection or otherwise. And if they say, why do you need to pop down? I say, well, I need to know what I'm sending the buyers to. So if it's okay, I just want to have a look at the property. Now, of course, if they get all sort of edgy here and they say to me, what do you want to come down for? I say, look, don't panic. All I want to do is pop down, say hello, and just give you a business card so you know where I am if you need me, and just have a look at the property and know what I'm sending the buyers to. I will not ask you to do anything you don't want to do. So you can see that these are non-threatening discussion type things where I'm offering help around getting the property sold. Now, as the conversations develop over the weeks, one of my favourite techniques is to call back. Basically on a Sunday afternoon was when I was most keen, and I just asked them how they went. And at that time, I'd then share with them the activity that I'd had through my open for inspections as a whole, because that number is usually overwhelming to them by comparison, given that they're selling one property. I would also then talk to them about any sales that we've made, what the buyer activity is, and if they wanted to dig a little deeper and start to mention to me that they had some interest. So one of my favourite lines is, have you had any offers? And if they say yes, and I say, well, what happened? They say, well, I just didn't run with it. And I say, well, then what did you do? And they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll ask them, well, what happened after the offer was made? They said, well, we said no. I said, well, now what do you plan to do? You see, because most private sellers haven't thought much beyond getting the property on the market, getting buyers through, and they believe that somebody's just going to magically pay the number. So I go on to then explain to them that all buyers make an initial offer that is rarely below the one that they're prepared to make in the end. And that is where our skill comes in creating negotiation parameters or negotiable parameters that exceed that most sellers can get. Because I go on to explain one more thing as it progresses. I'll say, listen, I know that you actually jumped on board to do this because you were looking to save some money. They say yes. I said, well, look, I don't think you're going to. They say, why? I said, well, just for a second, stop thinking or stop looking at this as though you're a seller, and just for a moment, imagine you're a buyer. You're looking at available property, and all of a sudden you happen across one that is privately for sale. As a buyer, what is the first amount of money you're going to expect to save should you be interested in the property? Now, they obviously answer, well, the agent's commission, given that it's not listed with an agent. I say, see? So effectively, you're not saving my fee, the buyer is. And in a way, you're doing my job for nothing. For how much longer do you hope to do that? And again, all of these questions then start to form the relationship as you are getting into a personable situation with them in an advisory role and positioning yourself well should the property not sell, should they not find a buyer. And if you're doing this with a great number of people, then it starts to make sense. Certainly, as the logistics start to get in the way, as every week them having to do the open homes, you'll find themselves wearing out. And then as you build the relationship, you can start to really push forward. Now, just have a look at a couple of these notes. And of course, there's some other ones. Now, if they do keep talking about the fact that they're sort of wary, they had a bad experience with a real estate agent, from this I would just say to them quite simply, say, look, at the end of the day, if Qantas lost a pilot tomorrow, if an aircraft went down, does that mean that you never fly? They say no. So one bad pilot doesn't prevent you from flying as a way of travel. No. Then why has one bad experience with a real estate agent caused you to distrust them completely? What if you had a good estate agent? What if you had a real estate agent that you could rely upon, that you could trust to get the job done? And there's some other little ones that if you had them, I don't know if you see them these days, but quite often when you do see private seller ads, they'll put things like no agents. Now, I've got to tell you, this is something I want to share with you. Those that have no agents are the first ones I call. Why? Because who on earth would put that there that didn't want to engage in an argument with an agent? In fact, it's almost like their last line of defense. These are the ones that are scared that a good salesperson will call them and get them, convince them to list the property with them. So when I call them, should they mention it? They said, look, it says on the ad, no agents. I just say, oh, I'm sorry. I thought it meant you didn't have an agent and you needed one. Now, I know that's a little bit lighthearted, but I always believe if they laugh, they list. Because over the years, I can tell you, as you get better at doing this, better at engaging these private sellers, you'll find that a lot of them put their property on the market privately to test the mettle of a good agent. They put it on there in the hope that they might be able to sell it, and only because they don't really understand what's going on. And indeed, should you be successful in getting that call or engaging in conversation with them, they'll like the cut of your metal, and it gives you every opportunity to list the property and move forward. So there's a good start. I hope that you can see where we're going with that. I'll just reiterate that the major name of the game is to get those 3 W's in order, not to push too hard for them. You know where the property is. Carefully look for what's your name, which you just blend into conversation. Be the first to call, the last to call, the one that calls most often in between, and then you'll get to that all-important 3rd W, which is when can I pop by? And when a good salesperson gets in front of a willing seller, magic happens, and you'll be listing more for sale by owners than you ever imagined possible. So thank you very much. I hope to see you next week when we wrap up or keep going on the subject matter of Ask Mark Anything. Thanks for joining.